Objective 6, demonstrate knowledge of principles and evidence-based instructional practices for promoting comprehension and analysis of literary texts. In the last video, we talked about comprehension broadly. In this video or part, we're going to be talking about comparing literary texts versus Objective 7, which will be informational texts. So let's do that. Most of everything that was said in the last video applies to both Objectives 6 and 7, in case you're jumping in here. If you are jumping in here, make sure you go back. Most of the important information to answer questions regarding Objective 6 and 7 are actually going to be in the reading comprehension video that cover across both. These are going to be questions that are, very specific to the genres, and we have a couple examples, but most of the reading comprehension questions apply to both. So definitely watch that prior video. All right. Comparing narrative or literary, as the MTEL will call it, versus informational texts. Okay, so we have these things called text genres, and text genres have different features to them, and they're organized in different ways. So we have what the literary or narrative texts, examples of that are fiction, historical fiction, biographies, fables, as well as poetry, drama, plays, things like that. Those are all going to be quote unquote literary, and in this slide I'm calling them narrative, but you'll see that the MTEL calls them literary. On the other side, we have informational texts, and there we have think textbooks, think social studies textbooks, think science books, expository, descriptive, argumentative, persuasive, procedural. Those are all texts where the goal is not to tell a story, it is to communicate information. So in Objective 6, we're going to be focusing on the left column, the literary/narrative. So here are elements that we explicitly teach to students as part of narrative text. So when we want students to recognize or better comprehend narrative texts, we help them become aware of the different elements that work across all narrative texts, right? So we have themes, we have settings, the place, we have characters, we have the point of view of the author, the characterizations of the characters based on that point of view. And then we have this whole plot, which has a story arc to it, in which case there's, where the story starts off, then rising action, climax, falling action, resolution, etc. So we teach all these elements of narrative text to students in service of helping them better comprehend. Because even if students have good vocabulary and are good decoders, sometimes they have trouble making sense of narrative text if they aren't metacognitively aware of the way that the plot works, or keeping track of each of the characters, right? Those are things that are outside of the reading rope that will also affect successful comprehension. So we explicitly teach these elements. So here, if we're teaching, a very common thing we'll do with younger students, and this would be an evidence-based practice for teaching plot structure or story structure, is we'll use what's called in this slide a story grammar marker. Sometimes you'll hear it as a story rope, but there's lots and lots of different visuals and multisensory manipulatives you can use to help students remember these narrative structures. So it'll look something like the teacher is holding a rope like this, and the face is the characters, and then the next piece will be the place, the setting, and then the teacher kind of moves the rope down piece by piece by piece, and then we move through the story like a rope, and then you can have students, of course, take the rope and practice becoming aware of those structures as well. So this is an example of evidence-based evidence-based practice for evidence-based practice for teaching narrative structure. Another big thing we do with teaching narratives, and of course links it to the writing piece, is helping students using graphic organizers to learn how to take notes, summarize, and bring out these setting structures, right? And we can see that like this specific graphic organizer, the story map, is only applicable to narrative text, which is why I saved this kind of graphic organizer here, because we're going to see in a moment that the way you organize graphic organizers has a lot to do with the text structure, right? You want to have a graphic organizer that matches text structure. I said that a bunch in the last video. So here's an example. This is a graphic organizer that matches a narrative text structure. We have the boxes, and it has each of the narrative pieces, and then we put those in an arc. Some people will do a graphic organizer called a story mountain, where they'll just do the plot points in a mountain where, it starts down here in the intro, and then we kind of get this visualization of climbing the mountain to the climax of the plot, and then following action and resolution. That's another example of a graphic organizer that's a powerful way to teach narrative structures. Okay, that's all that I really have to say specifically about narrative structure. If you memorize sort of these are the pieces of the narrative structure, we explicitly teach those pieces, and we have different evidence-based strategies to teach those. That's kind of all you need to know, and everything else is in the comprehension video. So here's objective 7: demonstrate knowledge of principles and evidence-based instructional practices for promoting comprehension. That's all the same of and analysis of informational texts, right? So objective 6 was the same thing except literary. Objective 7 is informational. So here are text features of informational texts, right? In informational texts, we have tables of contents, chapter titles, headings, glossaries, index. We also have in-text features in informational texts like sidebars, captions, labels, resources, links to videos or whatever, endnotes, footnotes, a bibliography, um, if applicable. And then a lot of times, most of the time in informational texts, there's going to be a lot of not just text, but also visual information that's crucial to understanding. A lot of times, like an entire chapter gets summarized in a very powerful infographic. As you can tell in these webinars, I'm a big infographic fan. So there's a lot of informational text features in photographs, maps, timelines, especially when we're talking about history and social studies, um, and graphs if we're talking about some sort of data. So here are a bunch of examples of different kinds of graphic organizers matched to the purpose of the informational text. And so what I want you to be thinking carefully about um, is what is when we're reading the MTEL questions, what is the objective that the teacher in the question has? And that is going to help you match what we should be doing to bring out those text features. The questions, they'll never have you make up the objective for the teacher because you don't know what the teacher's objective is. They're always going to give you the objective. And you have to infer from the goal that the teacher has in the question, what would be the tool to match that goal? And the questions are going to often trick you with multiple valid evidence-based practices, but they're not going to be matched to the appropriate objective. So when you're looking at the questions, like we'll look like in a second, that's what you need to be looking for. What is the thing that we're going to teach? So this first pattern up here is we have cause and effect. So if I'm teaching cause and effect, and that's the objective, I want students to understand why this event happened or why these characters did that. Then I'm going to have a graphic organizer looking like this because we have one cause, and then of course causes have multiple effects, so we have the effects coming off of it. If I'm going to show, I want the students to understand the order in which things happened, I'm going to use a graphic organizer like this, or a timeline. A timeline is going to communicate the order in which things happen. This is a sequence graph, right? Or I could do if I want the students to compare and contrast two different things, I'm going to use something like this, which is called a Venn diagram, or I'm going to use a table like this. Um, this is a matrix table where I'm going to have students make comparisons to each other. Okay. This is the goal that matches this is compare and contrast. Here, this is a description. So what you'll see in here is you'll put some sort of idea or concept in the center of this graphic organizer, and then there's going to be lines and other circles coming off of this. Okay, so this can be, this is a very vague version of it, which applies to all descriptions, but you might hear this in terms of a semantic map or a web. Um, I think the MTEL will call them semantic maps, is that when you're taking a concept, you're putting it in the center and you're exploring all of the things that connected to it. Semantic is a word. If we haven't gone over it, I can't remember if it's come up in previous videos, but semantic is another word for meaning. It has to do with meaning and understanding. Semantics and vocabulary are kind of related, interchangeable in some ways. So we have a semantic map in which students are trying to make connections between things. Okay, enumeration, that's just a fancy word for list. Obviously, if we want students to make a list of things or describe steps of things and orders, like this can be done in science. If you want to do a lab, you want students to enumerate and make a list of steps, or if they're doing cooking, here's the order in which you do this, something like that, right? Problem and solution, we have a table of problems and their matching solutions. Question and answer, I wouldn't really even call this a graphic organizer, but there you go. If you want students to offer questions and answers, you can call that set of box, right? These are all just different organizations of boxes and lines, or circles and boxes and lines. So, all right, let's get into some questions and you can see what I'm talking about. Number 59, pause here. Okay. The correct answer is C, having pairs of students use graphic organizers to compare how major story elements, such as setting, character, and plot, are conveyed in the three passages. So what is the objective of the teacher? Okay. The objective is, right at the top, promoting students' recognition of distinguishing features, of the text features. So if you want students to have a discussion, right, comparing them, what do you need to do? You need to make sure that the students are aware of those features, right? So we're going to have a discussion. In that discussion, we're going to compare them. But to prepare, if the goal is preparing for that discussion, then everybody needs to know them. So what are you going to do? You're going to give them a graphic organizer that has the major story elements, and they're gonna come prepared to that discussion with the setting, characters, and plot from each. Now, A and D are incorrect because they're just asking students their opinions of things, and while that's lovely, that is not related to the objective. And B is an interesting one because again, that's a thing that you might have students do, but it is not. I mean, it's obviously you're not explicitly teaching anything to the student that doesn't understand it, so that's a huge issue. But even for the students that understand it, you're not even having them make any comparisons, right? So yeah, they can take the notes, but if they're taking notes on things that are relevant to the story elements, then they're not prepared for that discussion. So using those graphic organizers is the correct answer. All right, 75. Pause here. The correct answer is C, timeline. Well, this is a fairly straightforward question. I wanted to give an example of a good one, but what are the key thing to this question is you're matching the objective to the kind of organizer. So in this case, we have a social studies textbook in which the teacher is trying to teach the sequence of events. June 17th, 1775, June 16th. When we're seeing dates, we're seeing these things. What we want to do to help students organize this information is we're going to provide them with a timeline. That's the only one matched to this. We might have students outline things. That's great for summarizing, not related to the goal. Venn diagram is for comparing and contrasting. We're not doing that here. And semantic map is for building understanding of a concept, and we're not building understanding here. The only one that makes sense is C, timeline. Number 65, pause here. The correct answer is A. How does the narrative point of view in the story shape a reader's understanding of events? So we have a teacher and we're asking, what is their objective? Okay, the students are reading a novel in first person. The teacher wants the students to write a new account of the scene as if it could be reported from another major character. So a classic example that we use with young students of this is we take the tale of the three little pigs, and then they get the tale from the pig perspective, and then we read the book, The True Story of the Three Little Pigs, which is the same story from the wolf's perspective, and then we get to help students understand how the same events can be looked on and characterized in different ways by point of view. So this is a thing that we have students work on. So that's the goal. So if that's the goal, what is the question um, that would be most appropriate for a group discussion following them doing that writing activity, right? And so after they've written that point of view work, what you want to do is have students examine and compare how the stories shapes the events. Um, B, C, and D, again, are all certainly things that we would have students do. And they are definitely helpful and they're appropriate school activities, unlike some of the other questions where we have things that are just not appropriate or just debunked nonsense. These things are all good and fine to teach, but they're not related to the objective of understanding point of view. So the only option in this case would be A. All right, short video this time. That is all I have to say about objectives 6 and 7. I will see you in the next video.